As I've explored in many videos before, we have a frankly terrible modern understanding of the Middle Ages. And by we, I mean the general public, not necessarily historians. From pop culture influence to the horrendous Victorian takes on history, to the simple fact that a lot of records either have not survived or were never written down, it's easy to look back on that millennium of history and believe what we've been told, that it was a dark age of chaos, grime, violence, and anti-intellectualism. Funnily enough, the same could be said of our modern era, but that's not the point. The Middle Ages were, as I've talked about, much brighter, creative, and vibrant than we give them credit for. But one thing is true. Much like all of human history, people have always been, and always will be, weird and prone to crime. And boy, were crimes in the Middle Ages really funny, or just downright weird. I wanted a series I could tap into when I need a fairly straightforward sort of short video to make, and historical crimes are truly the gift that keeps on giving. So, welcome to Weird Crimes from Historical Times, Part 1. I've had a really not great and stressful past couple of months, so join me as we chill and talk about some of history's most unusual criminals. Come learn with me. But first, a quick word from today's sponsor, Aura. As usual, yet another data security crisis has come up. Over 2.9 billion records were stolen from national public data, which provides personal information to employers and others doing background checks. These stolen records include a person's full name, address, date of birth, phone number, and most importantly, social security number, and members of the hacker group have apparently released this information for free online. Thankfully, I've been using today's sponsor, Aura, which is an all-in-one system that both protects my information and removes my data from various data broker sites automatically. The new news about this current data breach was so upsetting to me because I've had my data stolen and leaked multiple times before, and taking care of it has felt like a perpetual battle with a hydra, where you cut off one head and two more grow back. More than ever before, all of us are extremely vulnerable online, and it's vital to take action to protect ourselves. Thankfully, now I have Aura to take care of all of that and more for me. Between password protection, security scans, spam reduction, credit checks, and credit locking and more, I can rely on Aura to keep my info safe without the hassle of downloading a bunch of separate apps. Aura also gives you up to $5 million in identity theft insurance should the worst case scenario happen, and sometimes it does. I value my privacy and I value yours. You can go to aura.com/Kazro to start your 2-week free trial, also linked below in the description. I highly recommend that you do this right now because not only is national public data not going to do anything to help you, they probably aren't even going to face any repercussions for this leak, as is typical in these situations, unfortunately. Thank you so much to Aura for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to learning about a few weird medieval crimes. Our first case gets into some actually super fascinating history of medieval justice and animals as criminals. There were many random cases where animals were actually brought to trial. Pigs, geese, horses, even insects like locusts. A few of these stories are clearly apocryphal, but they are rooted in some truth. One French case from 1386 saw a pig being put on trial for murdering a child, wherein the pig was tried as a human, dressed in clothes, and hanged. An earlier case in 864 involved a swarm of bees that stung a man so much he died, and the Council of Worms, which was not a council involving worms, it was a council of the location worms, decreed that the hive must be suffocated because whatever honey they produce would be full of, like, bad, sinful energy. But getting back to the pigs though, they were by far the most commonly seen in court records. E.P. Evans writes in Criminal Prosecution and the Capital Punishment of Animals, the frequency with which pigs were brought to trial and adjudged to death was owing in great measure to the freedom with which they were permitted to run about the streets and to their immense number. The fact that they were under the special protection of St. Anthony conferred upon them a certain immunity, so that they became a serious nuisance, not only endangering the lives of children, but also generating and disseminating diseases. And unfortunately, sometimes pigs can be homicidal. One case in 1457 saw a pig tried for the murder of a 5-year-old boy, and her piglets were also tried as accomplices because some of his blood was on them. The pig's owner had to pay bail on the piglets, who were acquitted. So why the hell were so many animals tried like humans? It sounds really silly, but James McWilliams puts forth the perspective that it's a natural result of a pre-industrial culture. People used to spend a lot more time interacting with animals and nature, up to 16 hours a day sometimes. When you spend that long dealing with animals, you become a lot more intimately familiar with their personalities and how they make decisions. In the post-industrial world, people largely view animals as objects. While this theory is true, it's also true that medieval people did still view animals as possessions. So it's not far-fetched to guess that they were tried like humans, not because people saw them as humans, but because by committing a crime against humans, it's upsetting the natural order. Another historian, Peter Dinzelbacher, says that the phenomenon is simply due to the fact that the social stresses and social upheaval, epidemics, and general suffering made it a great catharsis to people to see an animal that caused suffering be put on trial. He suggested these trials were not wholly serious, in that they thought it made logical sense to try an animal in a human court, but more so because it would comfort the community, which, maybe it's all of the above. So there was this jurist in 16th century France named Bartholomew Chassenet who became infamous in one of these animal cases. Autun's court had leveled legal action against rats, which had been chowing down on the local barley crops. Now, this does sound very silly, and it is, but remember that to these provincial medieval villages, the harvest was a very dire and serious situation, and barley was a mainstay core crop for most of medieval Europe. A bad harvest, or one that is destroyed by sneaky rats, can mean a terrible loss in revenue for farmers, and worse, starvation for the villages, and indeed a very hungry season. So while it's hard to understand why this court would even bother taking rats to court, it sort of makes sense when you imagine the catharsis that it may provide. And in court, of course, the defendant must also get legal representation, and Bartholomew Chassenet was just that guy. E.P. Evans continues, he urged that inasmuch as the defendants were dispersed over a large tract of country and dwelt in numerous villages, a single summons was insufficient to notify them all. He succeeded, therefore, in obtaining a second citation to be published from the pulpits of all the parishes inhabited by the said rats. He excused the default or non-appearance of his clients on the ground of the length and difficulty of the journey, and the serious perils which attended it, owing to the unwearied vigilance of their mortal enemies, the cats, who watched all of their movements and, with fell intent, lay in wait for them at every corner and passage. So, in short, he argued that the rats couldn't appear in court because the trip to get there was too long and too dangerous, which was a logical move, given the rule that people could reject a court summons if they had no safe way to get to court, and considering the fact that rats already had such a poor reputation in medieval culture that their guilt was already a given. Chassenet went on to earn a prominent legal reputation and defended other animals too, and was even appointed the president of the Parliament of Provence. He also wrote a huge treatise documenting his theories and experiences with animal criminal law. He argued that because animals could not make rational decisions, it makes sense not to use capital punishment, unless the animal's crime involved shedding blood, and instead focus on preventative measures. A very logical mindset, but probably not the direction craved by bloodthirsty, angry barley farmers who would love to see a mass rat execution.
I already said it earlier, but I want to make it double clear just in case, because I'm editing this and I'm like, oh, some people are going to forget that I already said that these stories might be apocryphal. This is one of those stories where we have absolutely no idea if it actually happened or not. It's one of those stories where everyone says it really happened, but there's a lot of contradictory original sources and things like that, so take the story with a grain of salt, but yes, it is still very funny.
But I guess someone had to defend the rats, and Bart was that guy. Praise be the defender of rats. In the the 15th century, a new fashion ideal was hitting the streets. Everybody wanted a guy with a short tunic and long poulaines. During a good majority of the Middle Ages through the 18th century and early 19th century, one of the greatest markers of a handsome male physique was a shapely and muscular calf. This is one of the many reasons why a lot of historical menswear was a bit shorter with tight hose or stockings to show off that sexy, sexy calf. And if you had chicken legs, you could always stick like basically a chicken cutlet pad in there and DIY the calf yourself. And around the 1400s, the trend for sexy long legs became so powerful that the men's tunics inched shorter and shorter, and the shoes inched, well, longer. These shoes, called poulaines or Krakows after Krakow, Poland, where they are thought to have originated, had pointy toes that could get so long it actually got ridiculous. When you walked, the long toe point would be flapping around and make movement impossible. From personal experience, even these are a little bit hard to walk in. So dudes would have to tie them up to their ankles from the toe to keep them off the ground. By 1463, the court had decided that enough was enough with these, frankly, suggestive shoes flip-flopping all over the place, and many asses on view under mini tunics. The new law decreed, no person under the estate of lord, including knights, esquires, and gentlemen, to wear any gown, jacket, or coat which does not cover the genitals and buttocks. Also, not to wear any shoes or boots with pikes longer than 2 inches. So obviously this didn't ban dressing like a hoe outright, it just made it so that only lords and those even higher in status could wear them. Of course, the outrage and discourse over the fashions raged on, exemplified by the parson in Chaucer's writings, who exclaimed on the topic of codpieces, "Alas, some of them show the bulge of their shape and the horrible swollen members that seem like the malady of a hernia, in wrapping of their hose, and also the buttocks of them look like the hind parts of a she-ape at the time of a full moon." So, moral of the story, according to medieval sumptuary laws, being a fashionable skank is a privilege only awarded to the most wealthy and powerful. These laws were usually focused on men, funnily enough. For once, women were off the hook. But women found other unique and creative ways to offend the law, of course. So in the medieval era, even the most seemingly benign jobs ended up being extremely interesting. The lives of farmers, laundresses, and weavers were so vibrant, and of course, people got up to no good at one point or another. Dr. Eleanor Janega's newish book, The Once and Future Sex, is largely about a re-examination of medieval women's history overall, and it has a whole chapter about women's work, and not just women's work. Women, especially peasant women, had to obviously work to provide for their families. Same reason why children began working a lot earlier. If your family's poor, any able-bodied family member needs to get out there and go make some bread. Sometimes by making bread. If you had a little startup cash, you could start a bakery and sell various baked goods. Of course, this isn't easy. You need a baking space, you need to be able to build an oven, you had to be able to afford ingredients, and if you can barely afford to buy food for your own children, it's harder to get your hands on ingredients to sell. To make matters even more complicated, you couldn't even charge regular prices for smaller loaves of bread because there were actual laws regulating the weight of sold loaves. In certain eras and in places like Stratford, the literal sheriff would sometimes show up at your bakery and weigh the loaves himself. Underweight loaves got confiscated and sent off to prisons or used to feed the needy. So bakers had to get more clever with their tricks to try and cut costs. So those who had ovens to spare often rented out their ovens for others to use outside, whether by other bakers or wives who had no oven at home. One couple of bakers in 1327 named Lucy de Pykeringe and Alice de Breitenach did just that. Unbeknownst to their oven renters, the two women had crafted a scheme where they had cut a hole in a table and someone would hide underneath the table and open the hole, reach through, and pull off some dough from people's unbaked bread loaves as they sat out to rise. They then, of course, used the pilfered dough to create new Franken loaves to sell. Of course, eventually their, quote, false, wicked, and malicious bread crime was found out, and the two women were sent to Newgate Prison, where they claimed that Breadgate was actually all their husband's idea, but alas, they had to serve their time anyways. The men who had helped them, meanwhile, not their husbands, but like other family members, were hauled off to the pillory and publicly shamed by having pieces of dough hung around their necks. So all in all, a pretty tame case, but a really interesting one that actually reveals quite a bit about the nature of medieval women's work and the sorts of everyday small crimes that you might run into living in a village near a large city like London. But not all crimes were entrepreneurial in nature. Some of them were supernatural. So it seems like, from what I can glean, the 1390s were kind of a wild decade for witchcraft, just everywhere in general, and one contemporary source called the Chronicle of the Religious Community of Saint-Denis, written by Michael Pintoin, probably in the 1400s, covers the reign of French King Charles VI, wherein a rather unusual case of witchcraft occurs in 1398. You see, King Charles was dealing with an odd case of on and off madness. His attacks of the mind were random and often lasted months, and given that he was, the king, it was a little bit important that the guy had his wits about him. Problem was, no one knew how to get his wits back when they weren't about him. And then out of nowhere, here come these two Augustinian monks who claim that they can cure his insanity using their special superpowers. Well, the king had nothing to lose at this point, so fuck it, why not? So the monks chant incantations over the king and feed him potions that they made of pearls, and then they ask if they can slice his head open, which was an obvious no. Being denied the chance to literally slice the king's head open, the two monks then flipped out and claimed that the king's brother, the Duc d'Orléans concierge, and the royal barber were doing sorcery, as if they themselves hadn't just been chanting spells and making potions. Obviously, no one was buying these accusations, so the monks made an even more outlandish claim that actually the Duc d'Orléans himself was a sorcerer. So at this point, everyone was like, wait a minute, what are you two doing here anyway? And suddenly the two monks found themselves being hauled over to the Bishop of Paris's prison, where they were declared idolaters, invokers of demons, apostates, and sorcerers. Shocker. The punishment being death. Now, being that these two monks had insulted the king's brother and endangered the king himself, it's obvious that their executions had to serve as a warning to all of the citizens of Paris. They were led through the streets of the city with their names on their heads and a paper on their backs listing all of their offenses. When they reached their execution platforms, a lavish, taller platform rose above it, where the bishop stood alongside some other bishops. On their way there, the monks were stripped of their holy garb, their fingers scrubbed, and made to admit guilt to each line of crimes as the people of Paris watched. Then, on the platform, the sorceress monks were beheaded, and their various body parts were displayed around Paris as an example of what happens when you dabble with witchcraft and have the proverbial balls to threaten the crown with it. Sorry, this last one was a grim one, but isn't it weird? If you watched my video on medieval witchcraft, you'll know that this is an extremely unusual case, and not at all the standard for how sorcery appears in medieval times. But hey, it certainly makes for a very weird crime. Thank you for learning with me about some really odd crimes. I hope you enjoyed this more casual video, even though it's really short. I'm sorry. I needed one that wouldn't be like 500 hours long and wouldn't be a huge pain in the ass to research. It's been a rough one, y'all, so I appreciate your support. Don't forget to order yourself a copy of my graphic novel, Liberated, The Radical Art and Life of Claude Cahun, and until next time, wash thy hands, wear thy mask, and make sure your shoes are a sensible length.